This week's theme is play and place. The image shows my play triangle, and my prompt is to reconstruct the place in memory through generative interaction. When thinking about the theme of place, the first thing that came to my mind were the atmosphere, history, and the changes of a place. Our understanding of a place is now determined only by its current physical landscape. Traces left from the past, personal memories, and social memories gradually become part of how people understand a place. Even remains that originally belonged to industrial activities may gradually become naturalized and become something that local people think has always belonged there. At first, I wanted to use Melbourne as my material, since it's a place I can most directly access now. When I walk along the Yala River, I thought of the Yalingas project. Through sound, oral histories, and people physically walking through the site, it reconnected the present urban space with the past First Nation histories of the place. This was impressive, but at the same time, I started to think that, as a foreigner who has not been there for very long, it would be difficult for me to use Melbourne as my material, because its history is complicated, and I'm not familiar with it. I cannot even describe my hometown through this kind of narrative. Although I'm familiar with it, it is also not a place that can be completely described through one period of history or a kind of narrative. However, games do not have to describe a place only through narrative or visuals. Procedural rhetoric suggests that the rules and processes of a game can themselves become part of its expression. Therefore, I decided to use generated interaction to create a play about my hometown. Bogo's concept of procedural rhetoric made me start thinking about how the game mechanics themselves could participate in the expression of place. If the game presented a complete Mongolian grassland from the beginning, the player would still only be looking at the place that had already been defined by me. Therefore, I turned the reconstruction itself into the game process. At the beginning, the scene only contained the ground, while the grass, cloud, houses, birds, and sheep all need to be gradually generated through the player's input. This allows different players to create different expressions within the same game based on the different understanding of this place. The place I use is a border grassland in northern China, near to Mongolia, which is also my hometown. It is strongly influenced by Mongolian culture and is often associated with nomadic people. However, as history has developed, fewer and fewer people actually live on the grassland, and most people now live in modern cities. So do I. Despite this, when my hometown is mentioned, people's impressions of it are still the same as they were in the past. I used 3D to create an empty 3D ground to simulate the terrain of the grassland, and I also made 3D grasses and cloud models. In addition, I hand-draw shapes, birds, and yards and made them into 2D assets. I did this to distinguish between things that exist naturally and things that are placed into the landscape through human memory and perception. During the first playtest, players said they could feel that the place was a grassland, but because most of them were not from my hometown, their impressions of the place were similar. Therefore, I added a morinhur, which is a traditional Mongolian instrument, as a function to the interaction keys, with the number key 1 to 7 representing different pitches. At the same time, I also added an intro played with the morinhur, giving players the atmosphere of the grassland as well as a hint for the correct melody. After adding this function, players will try to reconstruct the melody from memory. Through fragmented memories and continuous trial and error, the scenes created by the players finally become more varied. My project requires players to interact through the keyboard. Different keys represent different generated objects as well as different morinhur pitches, and the players can interact based on their own understanding. They can generate the grassland in memory either through their existing impressions of the grassland or through the melody in the intro. In this experiment, I found that the same game mechanic can have different forms of feedback. Karen Collins, in Playing with Sound, discussed the interaction between players and game sound, as well as a multimodal experience formed by sound, image, and action together. Changing the feedback modality of a game mechanic can not only add another sensory effect, but may also change the player's attention, behavior, and their understanding of the same interaction.